Some myths and folktales are born in dark times. Others are ancient stories retold over many centuries that never seem to die. And some are a combination of both. A story, thousands of years old, that takes on new life as a culture undergoes major change. By the middle of the 17th century, Japan had almost completely closed itself off from the outside world and had become a land of secrets. In reaction to centuries of political and social instability and the growing influence of Christianity in the country, the shogun initiated a rigid policy of isolationism that would last over 200 years. During this Sakoku, or locked country period, Japanese trying to leave the island or trying to return home from abroad would be executed. Christian missionaries and converts in the country were hunted down, and some were crucified in order to send the shogun's message. Foreign influence would be silenced. The price for stability and peace had been paid. From this extreme isolation, Japanese culture turned inward and old stories resurfaced. Legends and dark folktales were collected and recorded, sometimes changed or evolved. Among these, there surfaced tales of the Rokurokubi, a monstrous creature whose head could leave her torso, either snaking upward and around corners with a head at the end of a long, flexible neck, or sometimes coming completely detached and floating around on its own. What are the origins of this creature, and is there some deeper question within ourselves that it embodies? While most often female, the Rokurokubi could also be male, and there are even stories about families or entire villages of them. The neck was often shown stretching grotesquely, but when the head would completely detach, the creature is sometimes referred to as a Nukekubi, which has a decidedly evil temperament. But many times, Rokurokubi is used to refer to both. This could be just an error, but there is a uniquely Japanese concept that would allow for a single creature to take on different behaviors and forms, so it's not totally out of the question to conflate the two creatures. We'll dive further into this later and into the distinction between the Rokurokubi and the Nukekubi, but for now, everything we'll discuss is either referred to in the source material as a Rokurokubi or given that name by the authors, so I'll do the same. The Rokurokubi probably originated from Chinese stories that made their way to Japan sometime between the 1300s and the late 1500s, but our first major Japanese source doesn't appear until the early 18th century. In 1712, a doctor from Osaka named Terashima compiled information from many disparate sources into the Illustrated Sino-Japanese Encyclopedia, Wakansansai Zue. These included stories from an already 100-year-old Chinese text known as the Three Realms. It referenced so-called flying head tribes, Rakutomin, in southern China and Southeast Asia during the time of the Qin dynasty, which ended in 206 BCE, almost 2,000 years before Terashima would set ink to paper for his encyclopedia. In other words, these creatures had supposedly existed for 2 millennia. These ancient tales said that at night, the heads of the tribal people would fully detach from their bodies and flap their ears to fly around eating insects before returning to the bodies by morning. Terashima included this in his text, and this was interpreted or paraphrased as the creature Rokurokubi. There are several theories about the meaning of the name, but the most likely is from the word rokuro, which is a pulley used to extend or retract rope. A Rokurokubi could come into being when someone was cursed due to their personal sins. However, many times there's no reference at all to how a Rokurokubi is created. They simply are what they are. The nature of the personal sin is often left unspecified, but infidelity is specifically mentioned in some sources. There are also cases where a wife suffers the curse of being a Rokurokubi as punishment for her husband's infidelity. It's unfair and misogynistic, but misogyny is unfortunately present in many myths all over the world. At some point, I'd love to do a study on the goddess myths and how gender and social structure changed myths and religion. Despite its deeply unsettling description, the Rokurokubi was not always depicted as an evil entity. In fact, many depictions of the Rokurokubi are fairly non-threatening, but undeniably creepy. In 1814, the famous Japanese artist Hokusai published a collection of sketches called the Hokusai manga. Manga here is not referring to the modern idea of comic book manga, but instead refers to the sketches themselves. Manga literally means whimsical pictures. By the way, this is the same Hokusai who would go on just a few years later to create one of the most iconic works of Japanese art, The Great Wave off Kanagawa. In the Hokusai manga, we get a calmer, more domestic view of a Rokurokubi, not terrorizing the countryside or floating around corners to scare her family, but going about normal housework, seemingly untroubled by her monstrous form. In fact, in some stories, the Rokurokubi is totally unaware of her darker form. She might transform after falling asleep, and her head would go sniffing around the house without her remembering a thing the next morning. She might lap up all of the oil for the lamps or commit some other mischief, but otherwise inflict no major harm. In general, the creature's behavior and even appearance can vary, which is in line with a very unique concept in Japanese myth. In Japan, there is a notion of a spirit or monster called a yokai, which encompasses an extremely wide array of beings. Sometimes yokai were indeed evil and terrifying, but they could often be indifferent, mischievous, silly, beneficial, or even all of the above, depending on their mood and on how you treated them. The concept of a yokai is surprisingly complex and deserves its own study, but for now, it's enough to understand that yokai embody a range of shifting behaviors and forms, and sometimes their behaviors don't align with what you'd expect. They could be very different creatures from one story to the next. In one tale of the Rokurokubi, two travelers arrive at a remote village near Mount Yoshino, a religiously significant site southeast of Osaka. The mountain is blanketed in 30,000 sakura trees, cherry blossoms, which you can still see to this day, and legends say that Mount Yoshino was the site where the first cherry blossoms were planted in Japan. Tired and hungry from their journey, the travelers appeal to the locals for help replenishing their supplies. The villagers are accommodating and generous, feeding the travelers and helping however they can. But with every passing moment they spend in the village, the two travelers begin to feel more and more uneasy. Eventually, they notice a very odd detail, something easily missed but plainly visible. Each and every one of the villagers is wearing a thick scarf around their neck so that nothing can be seen between the jawline and the torso. This was to hide the stretch marks or ring-shaped bruises often appearing on the necks of Rokurokubi during the day when they went about in their normal human forms. This particular story doesn't suggest that anything bad happens to the travelers. Presumably, they accept the villagers' help and move on, admittedly freaked out but no worse for wear. The Rokurokubi village is an example of this curse being something that people lived with without harming others. On the other hand, maybe the fact that the travelers left before nightfall was what saved them. In quite a different tale, we follow a samurai who has turned from the sword to the life of a wandering priest. One evening, while on his long travels, he stops to stay the night with a woodcutter and his family in the remote countryside. The family is warm and friendly. They feed him and talk with him, and when the sun has set, they leave him to his prayers and go to bed in the next room. The priest continues his prayers alone, deep into the night. At last, he stands and stretches and decides to have a drink of water before lying down. As he passes the room where the family sleeps, he looks through the doorway and stops dead in his tracks. Inside, he sees the bodies of the family members, including the children, all lying on the floor with the heads missing. There's no blood or sign of struggle. The heads have simply vanished. Heart pounding, he sneaks outside, and there he sees the heads flying around the garden, eating worms and catching flying insects in their mouths. As he crouches in the brush, he overhears them talking about how excited they are to devour him. He realizes he has stumbled upon a Rokurokubi, or perhaps more accurately, Nukekubi, home, and desperately needs to get past them. But how? Thinking back to an old text, he remembers that if the bodies are moved and hidden while their heads are unattached, the heads will become confused, bounce on the ground 3 times making horrible sounds, and then die. The priest gathers his old strength from his long past days as a samurai, and does exactly that. He escapes the woodcutter's home alive, and he takes with him a heavy, round souvenir that weighs down one of his travel sacks. These 2 stories show that yokai can take on totally different contexts and behaviors depending on the tale being told. Both were written as Rokurokubi tales, despite the second story aligning more to a Nukekubi, but they show you how these yokai are as varied in behavior as humans. The Rokurokubi is also associated with 2 other Japanese yokai in particular. The most common association is with the yokai we just mentioned, the Nukekubi. The Nukekubi is an evil creature whose head can detach completely from the body and float around spreading terror. In some cases, it feeds on human flesh and blood, giving rise to the idea that the Nukekubi is a Japanese vampire, which might give the wrong impression of the Nukekubi. The similarities are there, but the Nukekubi is quite different from a Western vampire. The second creature associated with the Rokurokubi underwent a major change in the Edo period, to take on a new form closer to that of the Rokurokubi. The Mikoshi Niudo is a figure you might find while wandering the mountains. It has the appearance of a monk, but as you look up at him, he continues to grow and grow until he towers over you like a giant. This description changes in the Edo period to include a long, flexible neck. Imagine walking alone in a dark forest only to hear a twig snap behind you. Without turning, you see a giant, flexible neck stretch over your shoulder to allow the giant to come face to face with you. This long neck naturally made the Mikoshi Niudo a sort of partner to the Rokurokubi, though the nature of that partnership is unclear. The head becoming detached while the body is asleep or unaware has psychological or even spiritual connotations. This can be understood to suggest the soul leaving the body, and the fact that the head does things that the person is totally unaware of speaks to the question of how we define a person. It's an interesting idea. If the soul leaves the body and the head goes around causing mischief, or worse, goes around hurting people, then what has been disconnected? Since the behavior of the head can be horrific, does that mean that those are the person's true feelings? Or should this simply be read as a kind of possession or curse, as an evil spirit taking over since the mind-body connection has been severed? The Rokurokubi can be seen as a kind of representation of this philosophical question. The other part of us, left to its own devices, goes about in the night seeking its own desires. Is it the animal side, or the evil incarnation of our more primitive drives? Maybe the fact that infidelity is mentioned as a reason for the curse factors in here. The soul comes detached from its natural state and goes around doing its own thing. That's the lady stepping out on her guy. A momentary slip when someone can act either out of character or in character at last. Whether depicted as neutral, positive, or evil, the Rokurokubi is an unquestionably unnerving creature. Born from ancient stories from China and changed into a Japanese body horror folktale, this yokai is certainly unique in Japanese myth and folklore.